I also forgot the dissection was happening, like, really bad. My oceanography trip went well. I didn't fall in the ocean.
Yeah, that looked fun.
Yeah. I didn't post the pictures yet. I was gonna. Did I add you to the...
There's a semi-truck jackknife on the interstate, so I barely made it home.
Exam on Thursday.
It's
We're
horrible.
going to do an exam Thursday. We're going to finish up content here. I want to finish up the evolution of the nervous system. Since last time we talked about nerves and neurons and how neurons function. This is a pretty interesting story here about kind of the evolution of the nervous system. And we're going to look at the squid again, my favorite. So anyway, and then we will answer any questions. I'll try to give you some hints as to what the test will look like. We'll look at the study guide and make sure it's kind of up to date. Then we have a shark section today. We're going to look at sharks and fishes. So we'll see how that goes. Sound good? Okay. And then let's see. When we get back, we're going to basically do a 1-2 punch. We're going to do amphibians and reptiles on Tuesday. We'll do mammals and birds on Thursday. And then I think of course, it always happens there when I'm talking. Then we said we're going to do so this will be amphibians and reptiles Tuesday, mammals and birds Thursday. And then we're going to have our lab exam 3 on following Thursday. So that Tuesday the 10th is kind of a lab review, wrap-up lab, etc. I think we're looking good for our lab exam on Thursday the 12th. And that way we have basically following week's lecture exam for. There we go. Sounds good. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the evolution of the nervous system. So, like I have always mentioned, sponges don't have any neurons to speak of. So they, again, they don't really have any mental features. So the earliest example, or the simplest example, would be the Cnidaria. The Cnidaria, they have a nervous system that essentially is, obviously I mentioned that they don't have mesoderm, but they do have striated muscles, skeletal muscles for adduction. They're able to actually kind of draw their body closer together. So here is an example of what's going on with like a jellyfish, for example, here. Obviously, if they want to swim, they have to coordinate all of their muscle cells to contract at the same time. So what their nervous system is kind of designed to do is, when there is a stimulus to contract, to swim towards the light or towards the surface or what have you, the whole umbrella structure contracts all at the same time. So what we have going on here is we have what amounts to like a nerve network. It's like entirely peripheral nervous system. So this is what's generally called like a nerve net, meaning that it has kind of this kind of like a fishing net or like a butterfly net. You basically have an interconnected nervous system, kind of all peripheral only, meaning that it's essentially extended nerves that goes out to the distant parts of the body to interconnect. If they catch a fish, like on this tentacle, for example, they'll have sensory cells that will, tell the whole thing to contract so they can kind of collect the fish and pull it up into its gastrovagal cavity. But here we have kind of the simplest nervous system you can think of. It's just basically an interconnected bunch of neurons that kind of represents what would be just a peripheral nervous system. not a central nervous system. We're going to move towards a central nervous system in a second. Okay, sound good? Cool. Okay, so then we move on to, does that work with the purple and red, or should I change colors? You good? Okay, sure. Okay. All right, so then the flatworms, platyhelminthes. The platyhelminthes, the flatworms, the big situation with them is they were an organism that had cephalization. They had sensory cells, namely eye spots, that occur on one end of the body, and then a whole bunch of clustered neurons to support light dark or vision, or very rudimentary sight. So with the platyhelminthes, this cephalization really is kind of a neurological situation. Flatworm here. Here's our flatworm, and we have these eye spots here. And associated with those eye spots, we have clusters of cerebral ganglia. So here we have cerebral ganglia. So that basically would be the beginning of what would be like a centralized nervous system. A nervous system that's kind of like, focused around essentially one feature. So it's not really a brain, it's just a cluster of neurons that are processing sight. And then they have what is kind of generally described as a nerve ladder. So this would be like a nerve ladder. And what that means basically, it's kind of like a step ladder, or like a ladder you go on your roof with. We have these longitudinal nerves that go from the cerebral ganglia to the back of the organism. And then we have these transverse neurons, or transverse nerves, that will connect the two sides. So I guess this essentially represents what the Nigeria has, which is kind of like a peripheral nervous system. But this is kind of new, where we have sort of like kind of a centralized decision-making center. So maybe this would be like a central nervous system rudimentary, and then this is the peripheral, meaning that it has kind of like the rudimentary beginning of a central nervous system. That's kind of the idea there. But the general way you can think about it is it's kind of like a nerve ladder, where we have, they're usually negatively phototactic, which means they move away from light. So the decision to crawl away from light goes here, and the decision is sent back here. But if something pokes them here, or they get some sensory feature here, the peripheral nervous system can kind of communicate coordination and such. That's kind of the idea. All right, so then we have our, the next kind of step is, and then the important kind of feature here is that this was that cephalization, meaning that these organisms had a anterior end because they have sort of like a head feature, which is a cluster of neurons at one end of the body. Bilateral symmetry versus radial symmetry. Okay, moving on to the annelids. The annelida. So we're going to go with kind of the same theme here, is that we have a cerebral ganglia feature of the annelids. Like a simple segmented one. Okay. All right, and so there are many annelids that have eye spots or eyes. In fact, most of them would, because the marine polychaete worms are much more diverse than earthworms. Earthworms don't really have vision spots because they're burrowing underground. Well, let's just go ahead and look at the general annelida. They would have cerebral ganglia, in the case of like a polychaete worm, it would be for supporting eye spots, or vision. But here we have cerebral ganglia. Which is a cluster of nerve tissue for sensory and decision making. And then what happens is they have ganglia at every segment of the body. And connecting those is essentially two longitudinal nerves. So it's like a paired nervous system or paired nerve cord, something like this. So what we got going on is cerebral ganglia, and then we have segmental ganglia. So these are essentially localized decision centers or localized brains that occur, and they're not really a brain, but a ganglia is kind of like a brain. It's a localized kind of brain-like structure that occurs in every segment. So it's almost like every segment has its own little decision-making center, but then there is this master decision-making center here. So what you can kind of say is going on here is there is we have sort of like a centralization of the peripheral nervous system here. So we can say that this is, these two longitudinal nerve cords are basically the same idea, and they're homologous to these longitudinal nerve cords. And these had transverse nerves, but rather than transverse nerves, we have those now developed into kind of like segmental ganglia at every one of these segments here. So, and I'm kind of just drawing it simply here, but every segment basically has its own little local brain that controls the actions and what's going on at that location. So what you can kind of see is now we're emphasizing a central nervous system and less of a peripheral nervous system. So the nerves are kind of being pushed more central. So central nervous system, CNS, is kind of what we're moving towards, where everything is being kind of clustered into ganglia for decision making. And this happens basically in every segment. What else can I say about this? I think that's a pretty good idea. So, we go from peripheral only to cerebral ganglia with peripheral posterior side, and then now we're going with cerebral ganglia and then ganglia at every segment. And so kind of the peripheral system is kind of becoming less and less of the dominant feature. Okay, moving on to the arthropods, arthropoda. We're going to continue with this feature, but what's going to happen is we're going to move the segmental ganglia anteriorly. So here we go. Let's see. Let's get like a cockroach or something like this. We have, the tagmosis where we have a head, thorax, and abdomen. Let me change this a little bit. Okay. We have the head. We have the thorax. We have the abdomen here. Okay. So. And then, we have eyes on these insects, for example. We'll talk about the evolution of eyes and sensory cells after exam 4. But, let's see here, pretty much. Oh, there it is. Okay. So here we have our insect with legs at the thorax. So the head is all sensory, antenna and eyes and feeding structures and pharynx. So that's all the sensory structures. So there are cerebral ganglia and then ganglia that kind of support the feeding and mouth parts, etc. I'll talk about what that is in a second. And then there are basically a ganglia for every thorax segment. This. And then there are ganglia at the abdomen, but not necessarily in every segment. It's like everything is kind of being moved towards the head end. So you can say that in this case, what we have is sort of like an anteriorization of the central nervous system. There's basically more segments than there are ganglia. So like in the earthworm, it's kind of hard, I just drew this to be simple and fast, but in the earthworm, there is a ganglia at every segment of the body. Every segment has a little brain-like ganglia at it. Whereas in the insect, they've kind of concentrated them. Like, for example, the cerebral ganglia is just one set of ganglia that represents 3 or 4 segments. And then the subesophageal ganglia is a ganglia that represents 3 or 4 segments. And then we have thoracic ganglia and abdominal ganglia. But everything's kind of being pushed up to the anterior end of the organism. So there's kind of like an anteriorization. Migration or evolution of this. Okay? All right. So, one thing to note here is there's a paired nerve cord. It's basically 2 longitudinal nerves that run anterior to posterior, kind of like a parallel paired nerve cord. And that seems to be homologous with all these. What's also interesting is how the nerve cord associates with the gut tract. Let me go back to my flatworm and my segmented worm here to kind of demonstrate what happened. Like in the flatworm, we have, this is like a lateral view of flatworm. Flatworm is kind of like an animal, looks like this, and we have a pharynx that enters in from the ventral side. So what's happening here is the pharynx is the opening to the gut tract. The gut tract basically is kind of like the gastrovascular cavity. The GV cavity, or the gut, is inside the organism like this. And what's happening with the nervous system is because the eyes are kind of looking up, these things are crawling organisms. The eyes are on the dorsal side of the head, and so the eyes, the ganglia that support the eyes, are kind of more dorsal. But this nerve bladder is for controlling the crawling muscles, and all those crawling muscles are kind of ventral. So what happens here is we have a dorsal gut and a ventral nerve. So this nerve is ventral nerve. And then we have a dorsal ganglia. And then the gut is dorsal of the ventral nerve. So that was kind of how the arrangement is set up. But if you think about here, this gut has to actually pass through the middle of this nerve ladder. So if you look to see where the pharynx would be, the pharynx would kind of be somewhere right there. The pharynx has to pass through that nerve ladder system. The same holds true with the segmented worm, the annelid. We have kind of a system. I'll draw something like what this looks like here, and this would be the same for the insect here. So we'll kind of do this. This is like a side view. Oops, I got a little super into my segmentation. This is like a side view of the worm, segmented worm, but you could say just easily just insect as well. Okay, so here's our worm, and then here would be like if it was a polyhedron worm, we would expect eyes to be on the dorsal side. So there would be cerebral ganglia that would kind of be responsible for detailing vision and sensory things. But then we have our segmental ganglia, because it's crawling, it's an organism that's crawling on the bottom. We have a ventral, locomotion nervous system. So we have ventral nerve, and then we have this dorsal ganglia. And again, the gut has to pass somehow through the nervous system, because there's a dorsal ganglia and a ventral, what's called a subesophageal ganglia, basically the ganglia that regulate pharynx, etc. So here's the gut tract, does something like this. So the gut tract actually passes through the nervous system. So the pharynx here is basically passes between the cerebral ganglia and the next ganglia below the pharynx that basically control feeding. Same thing would be, that's why I said I'm not going to draw the insect, it would be the same kind of idea, but we have basically our pharynx would be passing through the nervous system there. Okay? So, we got a problem when it comes to developing a brain or a more complicated central nervous system. So here we go with the mollusca. Specifically, we're looking at the squid. Mollusca cephalopoda. Let's go ahead and say we're looking at cephalopods. Because like the limpets or the kites or snails kind of have what's going on here, but I think I had that article posted with the mollusca indicating that octopus, for example, have about the same mental capacity and intelligence as like a dog or maybe a lab rat. They found that octopus have the ability to problem solve and learn kind of at the same level as like a lab rat or a dog. So with a squid, what's going on is they have what is considered to be a true brain. And we know that the squid have, very, very complicated eyes, vision. Their eyes are super sophisticated and able to see, depth perception, colors, etc. They have a very, very complex ganglia for their eyes. And essentially what they have is all of their ganglia are concentrated only in the head. So they have, let me go ahead and fix this a little bit here so I can show this. They have what amounts to a rudimentary brain. So what we have here is a brain basically is all head ganglia. So what that means is they've moved all of their ganglia from their body to their head only. And that's kind of what the definition of a brain is when all of your central nervous system ganglia features are all located in one spot, which would be your head segment. They have peripheral nervous system, but basically it radiates from the brain only. There's no ganglia in the mantle or in the rest of the body. It's all located in the head. So now we've got a little bit of a design problem in that the squid evolved from an ancestor that had a dorsal cerebral ganglia, but a ventral nerve. And so what happens is they have to have their gut tract. They have to have their gut tract pass through their brain. And, but the conflict that I'm trying to describe here, let me just go ahead and find an image online. The conflict here is the more developed the brain becomes, the more interference it has with the digestive tract. So squid are actually said to have, like the general description of how it works, is they have a donut brain. And the donut brain basically is the brain of a squid has basically a hole in the middle like a donut does. And that's so the gut tract can pass through the cerebral and all the other head ganglia. And the reason is because we have this kind of ancestral baggage that these crawling type invertebrates all had a cerebral ganglia, but a dorsal cerebral ganglia, but a ventral locomotion nerve. And now we have essentially that as like a limiting factor. That generally this is described as a donut brain because the gut tract basically has to pass through this brain. So if the squid were to develop any more brain size, it would limit the esophagus to what food can pass through it. So if you remember when you pulled the esophagus or pharynx out of the squid, that the esophagus was this tiny little thread. And that's possibly one reason why squids diet kind of like vampires. They're feeding on the liquid or the very, very small particles of the organisms they eat. They're not like swallowing the whole fish. They're just taking in small bits or liquid from their prey. So what we have going on here is there is an interference between the gut tract, the esophagus, and the development of the brain becoming any more sophisticated or developed. So the squid are said to have this donut brain as kind of an example. How I kind of describe this is a term I kind of made up, is ancestral baggage. Because what you have going on is it's a plumbing issue that was established probably way back in evolutionary history. But at this point, they can't get around, or they can't really circumvent that problem. Circumvent meaning getting around the problem. Right? So this is kind of an interesting story, is because invertebrates, with the way they developed, with the ventral nerve because they were a crawling ancestor, and a dorsal cerebral ganglia because they were looking up possibly at predators, etc., kind of came to an end here. Okay, so lucky for us, with the chordates or the vertebrates, the vertebrates basically evolved presumably from a swimming ancestor. I said this last time, is that the tunicates were an example of the tadpole larvae that show the notochores in the tail, and that was a swimming feature. And then all of the primitive chordates and the simple vertebrates like the lamprey we saw basically were all swimming organisms. So if we look at, say, for example, a fish here, we're looking at basically an organism that is set up not for crawling, but for swimming. So here we have the nerve cord, the nervous system, is dorsal. So here we have a dorsal nerve to regulate swimming and digestion, etc., and dorsal brain, where all the ganglia are located in the head. So they have a true brain because there's no ganglia in the posterior part of the body. And the digestive tract is ventral. So we have a ventral gut. So in this way, the vertebrates never, even way back to the tunicate, never had a conflict or a collision between their nervous system and their digestive system. And the general notion is because they came from a swimming ancestor, the nervous system was already established dorsally when the gut tract was formed. And so there didn't have to be this passage through of the nervous system. So, thank goodness for us, otherwise squid might have dominated the world, before we did, right? So the idea there is that there is, sometimes you can have situations where there is kind of a, I'm not going to say a bad design plan, but the plan of how to make a cerebral ganglia into a brain really wasn't thought of here. And when we got to the point where we developed all the ganglia in the head to be a true brain, there was already an established conflict between the gut tract. So it's sort of like an evolutionary dead end, so to speak. I call it ancestral. Okay, so you can imagine a good test question that would be describe the evolution of the nervous system across these organisms. And the theme, again, I've tried to hit every one of them. A simple nerve net for peripheral nervous system only. Here we have an establishing of a rudimentary central nervous system, a cerebral ganglia, and a nerve ladder. Here we have the nerve ladder. It's become kind of centralized, so we're basically focusing more on what would be considered a true central nervous system. And then we're beginning to anteriorize it, where we take the ganglia and push them all towards the head end of the organism, where it's kind of biasing towards the front, the head. And I know this is upside down, but basically when all of the ganglia are in the head, that's what we call a brain. That's kind of the big theme there. So anyway, imagine a test question where I'm kind of asking you about Cnidaria, flatworms, segmented worms, arthropods, and basically how about this? One question will be about just those four, and I'll ask you to show kind of the progression of nerve net, nerve ladder, centralizing the nervous system, and then anteriorizing the nervous system, right? That's one question. And then I'll probably ask you a separate question about what's the problem for squid in developing their brain or their intellectual capacity. Squids and octopus, basically the problem is because their ancestor had a dorsal cerebrum and a ventral nerve, their gut basically has to pass through their donut brain, and it limits basically, which one can develop further, the brain or the gut. So you kind of have to choose, right? And then an additional question would be, how have vertebrates gotten around this, circumvented it? And how they've gotten around it is because they derived from a swimming ancestor. The nerve and the brain were basically dorsal to begin with. The gut tract evolution didn't ever have a conflict, right? So that's kind of like three separate question ideas. First one would be compare Cnidaria, Platyhelminthes, Annelida, Arthropoda. Next one would be to describe the problem for the squids and octopus. The third one would be how have vertebrates gotten off scot-free and they can go to college like you. Okay, good. All right. So, any questions? So that will be the end of our topics. So probably best if we kind of move backwards, right? Like if we kind of move in reverse. Maybe like we'll spend the rest of the hour here looking at a review to speak of. So let me log into Canvas here and let's see what we have for a study guide.